So I'm Dave Zvenyach. I'm a lawyer. I'm a lawyer with the district government, and in particular, I'm a lawyer for the legislature. And today we're going to be talking about annotating the law and how you might be able to help us make a better government. All right, so first, a couple of formalities. The first is the clear disclaimer. The views here are not the views of the government of the District of Columbia, the Council of the District of Columbia, lawyers generally, or nitpickers, or really anyone else. This is my view. These are my views, and so you can blame me. Another thing, and I realized this yesterday while talking to several of you, is that there's an ambiguity in my vocabulary, which is that I use the word code in a way different from the way that most of you use code. I use code to mean law code. Many of you, and I do on the side, use code as like web code or software code. So today there's going to be an ambiguity because we're actually going to use both, and there's a reason for that. All right.
Annotating your uses of the word code for
I would like that. There's actually going to be little pop-ups coming off from my head. The other thing too is that for the following slides, I'm going to be speaking about the United States Code and not the DC Code for the most part, and that's because it's more applicable across states. DC, there's Tolstoy's quote, right? All families are happy in the same way, but all unhappy families are unhappy in their. I don't know what his quote was, but the point is that all jurisdictions are slightly different. DC has its own quirks, and so I'm just going to focus on the United States Code because that's more accessible for a lot of folks. All right, so. First, a little bit about how a law is made. And so forgive me for the next few slides because you really have to understand this. Now, there's not going to be a quiz. You don't have to memorize it. But just sort of get this, right? So, first of all, does anybody really feel like they understand how a law is made in the United States Congress? Right? So, famously, lawmaking is sausage making, right? All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about sausage making for a minute. In the beginning, a bill gets introduced. All right. Then it goes to committee. Then, once it's in committee, it'll get amended. Once the committee's done amending, the committee will report the amended bill. Once it gets reported, it goes to the full floor, and then it gets amended again. Once it gets approved, the process starts over in the other house. And so, let me go back, right? So then it goes to committee, then it gets amended, then it gets reported, then it goes to the floor and gets amended, and it goes back to the other house. And if the houses can't totally agree, they conference, and in conference there are more amendments. Once the conference is done amending, they report a substitute. And once both houses agree on the substitute, it goes to the executive. Once the executive signs it or doesn't sign it, it gets codified. Who's exhausted? Problem is we're not done. Once it gets codified, it gets interpreted by administrative agencies who do it by rulemaking. Once it gets administrated by rulemaking, it gets applied in an administrative proceeding, typically an adjudicatory action. Once it's applied in an adjudicatory proceeding, then it goes to court. Once it's applied in court, the court looks back to the text of the bill and sometimes even the legislative history that happens in steps 1 through 17, and they look at the legislative history. And here's the best part. All of these steps involve completely different documents. And that's why there are lots and lots of books, right? Lawyers love books. This is like the best image that you can possibly imagine of what it's like to be a lawyer, just having like books. Except they're not really books anymore. They're all sort of in databases, and particularly commercial databases. So I have to pay for them, right? So what's weird is that lawyers actually do keep track of all of these changes and all of these various documents, and they keep track of all these steps. And the way that they do it is through annotation. What do I mean? So this is actually an example of the United States Code. And what you can see is that they actually have the law, and then they have the annotations right below the law, right? So here you go. You've got Section 111, repeals as evidence of prior effectiveness. And then the text that follows is actually what Congress enacted into law, and President signed and approval. And then there's this little thing below it that says references in text. And that reference in text is actually put together by a codification council. The United States House of Representatives, it's the reviser. In my office, it's the codification council. And some poor sucker is actually sitting there annotating the code and annotating the law so that you're able to keep track. And you'll note that there will be further annotations where they keep track of, well, this is when it was enacted. And these were the amendments that were made. So at one point, it used to be the archivist of the United States, and now, now it's the archivist of the United States. It used to be the Administrator of General Services, so these changes were made in 1984, and that's how lawyers keep track of things, right? So we can go back to the annotations, we can go back to the law. But it's really kind of clunky, right? This is not a good way of keeping track of things. And frankly, from lawyers, it's not easy to use, right? It's also, this is a dirty little secret, it's also really, really hard to make annotations. In fact, we pay people to do this. So in the district government, even though it's our law, even though it's our code, we ultimately have to contract out the vendors to help us generate our own code. And there's been a whole, discussion about what that process should look like and whether it should be copyrighted and all that. I don't want to get into that right now. I'm just saying it's a really hard process. And there are many, many reasons why it's hard. And it ought not be that hard. So how can we do it better? Well, let's go back to basics and let's think about annotation. So one of the reasons that I think this conference is really exciting is because you're taking annotations seriously. This is sort of a great example of what annotations look like in the old context. But I want you to imagine what this might look like in the legal drafting context. So for those of you who are not from DC, this is all anybody can talk about in DC. This is Bow Wow. Bow Wow is a panda, and this is like the big, big thing in DC. So today we're going to declare the official animal of the District of Columbia Act of 2014. We're actually going to pass a bill. We're going to declare Bow Wow to be the official animal, right? But so the problem is that there's sausage making, right? We're not going to just keep it that way. We're going to change it. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to get rid of the District of Columbia because that's not how it's supposed to be done. It should just be official animal. And we're not going to do it as an act. We're going to call it designation resolution because that's how we're doing it. We're going to do it by resolution, not an act. And I'm not getting into those details. Just trust me. That's what we'll do. Okay? So that's Amendment 1. But we're not done yet. We also want to make sure that we're not getting rid of dogs and cats and other things that might be well liked. We want to focus on zoo animals. So this is going to be the official zoo animal of the District of Columbia. Except, remember, we still have District of Columbia here. In Amendment 2, we have District of Columbia there. We're going to change all that. So what we're going to do is we're going to reconcile it so that we have the official zoo animal designation resolution of 2014. Right? So the state of the art right now is we have documents. We have the introduced document. We've got the amended document. Amended documents, the final documents, and all this is going to be reconciled at some point later. Wouldn't it be just cool if you could actually just annotate it and see what the changes were? That's something that should be doable. So, one document. And it's really not hard, right? It's just version control, right? And we already actually know what the document should look like. It should be the code. So, we started doing that in DC. This is an unofficial version of the code, and here's the cool part. And so if the code is on GitHub, right, we should be able to use it like GitHub, right? In fact, that's actually what we're planning on doing to keep the code up to date, is using a Git-based backbone. But wouldn't it be cool if I can keep the code up to date. But wouldn't it be cool if somebody else could actually submit a pull request directly here and say, this law ought to be changed in the following way? Right? So imagine that if you saw the official zoo animal designation resolution of 2014 and you said, you know what, it really should be an act. Wouldn't it be cool if you were able to just take the amendments and put it back? And this should be really simple. You're already almost there. All you need to do now is create the way for the public to make a pull request on the law through annotation. And if we do that, the upside is not just for the public, it's also for the government, because a well-structured legal annotation system needs a more useful code, and hopefully one that's easier to make. So pull requests, not to. That's my presentation.
Hi, thank you for a fantastic presentation. Just wondering if you saw GitHub and the background technology. Git is really great for programmers, right? Yep. And it has quite a high technical threshold, and there are problems. What is pull request, a common lexicon, and what does merging mean, and how do you manage this and pull this up to the front for a member of the public to actually understand what's going on and manage it without heavy intervention of third parties to be able to coach them, hand-holding all this. So you said that it sounded like you were progressing away from GitHub and using Git just in the background. Is that where you're going, or what's your reflection on these issues?
So we are using Git as the backbone. We're not using GitHub. We're publishing some of it on GitHub, although we're not going to exclusively publish on GitHub for obvious reasons. But I think that you've touched on exactly the point, and one of the reasons that I'm here. GitHub's great, but it's not for the public. And there has to be a way that if I go back to, I unplugged unfortunately, but if I went back to the code and you could see where it's published, it would be a great feature for somebody to be able to just highlight it. And you can do inline annotations. That's not actually, we know that's not hard, but it would be great if there was a way for somebody to actually say, I want this to go to Congress. I want this to go to my legislator and have that be accessible. And so I have to give a little bit of a shout out. Open Gov Foundation, Chris and Bill are back there. They're working on technologies that are actually related in the bill drafting process. So there's Madison is a project that they're working on, which would allow you to communicate directly to legislators while they're generating the code. And they built the America Decoder project, which allows for you to basically say this particular provision of the law is good or bad or indifferent. But what I think would be helpful from our standpoint is if there was a way to actually, when we publish the code, make that a feature that's available for the public. And specifically, if there's a bill that, or if there's a tool that legislators could actually look at the code themselves and say, this is what I want to change, and they could actually generate the bill that would go to the floor and go to committee and all that, that would be a major advance. Because legislators are people too, and they want to be able to annotate the code just like you do.
Great talk, and thanks a lot for stressing the importance of all this. Two small remarks is, first, in Europe, in particular in the European Parliament, we have a much better situation of consistency. Unfortunately, this is done by Word documents full of macros that won't run or do strange things, but there is hope there. Second thing, when President Obama, in his beginning of his first mandate, said he would submit law to comments by the public before promulgating them, we actually volunteered our tool that was one of the few tools that at the time could handle laws that are sometimes only in text format, 3 million signs, like the stimulus plan, and but they never answered. I mean, actually, and we wrote through lots of official channels, and even the work of the Sunrise Foundation, for example, to organize public markup was, so we need lots of pressure if we want the law to be truly annotable.
So I have two reactions to that, and not to belabor sort of my involvement in this space, but I am a government bureaucrat with the best of them, right? You know, when I got into this a year ago, the code wasn't available, it wasn't linkable, it wasn't downloadable, it wasn't XML. You could, there were lots of reasons why it wasn't accessible. But what totally changed my view on it was when I started to realize that this is actually a tool that's useful to the government. That when we opened the code and we started doing things in a more user-friendly way, that it actually meant that as a consumer of the code, because I do look at the law every day, that those tools would actually be beneficial to me. And I think that that use case is something that's often overlooked.